more people to do it in the future.
Neil O'Brien.
3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, while the government can and has been managing the security risk, it is essential that the cybersecurity and engineering flaws in Huawei products are fixed. The National Cybersecurity Centre has set out the improvements we expect the company to make and will not compromise on the improvements we need to see, in particular, sustained evidence of better software engineering and cybersecurity.
O'Brien.
I wondered if the Minister could provide an update to the House on the distinction the government is making between different types of infrastructural equipment from Huawei and how that will be used to respond to the recommendations of the Centre.
Well, we have the independent Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre to look at what the company is doing in order to meet the commitments we require of it. Looking to the future, Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to taking decisions on the 5G supply chain based on evidence and a hard-headed assessment of the risk. We've undertaken a thorough review of that supply chain, and the decisions of that review will be announced in due course and to this House first.
Dan Jarvis.
Mr. Speaker, given the concerns about Huawei's involvement in our 5G network, what more can the Secretary of State say about what steps are being taken by the government to secure our critical national information infrastructure?
What I can say to the honourable gentleman is that, from the government's point of view, the security and resilience of the UK's telecoms networks is of paramount importance. We think we have robust procedures in place to manage any risks to national security today. In looking forward to the rollout of 5G, we've got 3 clear priorities here: stronger cybersecurity practices across the entire telecom sector, greater resilience within individual telecoms networks, and, crucially, diversity in the supply chain for 5G. It's matters that go beyond any single company.
Mr. David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor of Duchy will know the government's about to award a £300 million contract, including requirements to host British citizens' biometric data. In order to protect the security and privacy of British citizens, can you guarantee that data will not be held by foreign companies subject to foreign government laws giving foreign government access to British citizens' private data?
Well, clearly, any tendering exercise that the government undertakes has to be subject to the normal rules about open public procurement. But I know that the Home Secretary, who is responsible for this particular proposed database, will give the highest priority to ensuring the security of that sensitive personal data.
Platt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has been reported that the Prime Minister has given Huawei the green light to help build the UK's 5G network against the advice of ministers, our international allies and our security services. Yet Huawei have themselves said that it will take up to 5 years to secure their equipment. So why does the government have more confidence than Huawei in their ability to safely and securely build our 5G network?
That's right. As I said in response to her honourable friend, the member for Barnsley, the security and resilience of our telecommunications networks is of paramount importance in every decision the government takes on these matters. We have undertaken a very thorough review of the entire 5G supply chain. That is designed to ensure that we can roll out 5G in a way that is secure and resilient. We will announce our decisions about that to this House in due course.
Brown.
Question 4.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is committed to supporting measures to reduce the size of the other place, where they can command consensus across both houses, such as the positive trend in retirement. My honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is also committed to continuing the restrained approach she has maintained on appointments.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister mentions consensus, but the reality is, due to Brexit and the failed PM leadership, this House is completely gridlocked, which actually gives the bishops, the hereditary peers and the unelected lords in other places more power than ever and a greater say in Scotland's future than the Scottish Parliament itself. Does he agree with the Scottish Tory colleague, the MSP Murdo Fraser, that other place needs scrapped?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last week we sat, the Scottish National Party were praising the House of Peers. This week they're calling for them to be scrapped again. For me, the focus now, with the issues facing this country, is to get on with delivering a Brexit deal that works for the whole United Kingdom, rather than focus our time on building constitutional grievances like the separatists wish to do.
Michael Fabricant.
May I congratulate my honourable friend on his appointment to the front bench and his outstanding responses just now. Notwithstanding any reservations we may have about the unelected place, is it not the case, though, that on occasion the standard of debate there can be a lot higher than here?
Yeah.
Well, I thank the honourable member. I'm sure over his 27 years in this House, he'll have seen plenty of very high standard debates. In fact, it's him contributing to raising that standard on many occasions. But the House of Lords plays a special part in our Constitution as a revising chamber, subject, as always, to the supremacy of this elected House.
David Linden.
The honourable gentleman's pardon. I think the honourable gentleman wants to come in from the front bench. Yes? Let's hear the fella. Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I welcome the Minister to his place. Unelected, out of touch, unresponsive. The House of Lords is not just a relic from a bygone era. It is a stain on our modern democracy. When is this cabinet team going to live up to its public duty and lead a serious constitutional debate in this country to modernise our democracy and get rid of the House of Lords?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, as I touched on earlier, the vast majority of people in this country, certainly in Torbay and across the rest of the UK, would not see this House spending months in constitutional navel-gazing as the top priority at this moment. Yes, the House of Lords is something that many people have talked about reforming over the last century, and the government will look at proposals that could enjoy broad consensus. But for now, with the pressures on the legislative programme, few would understand if we decided to dedicate months to this one.
David Linden. Number 5.
Thank you. I'm pleased to tell the House that from the 1st of April, the government increased the national living wage by almost 5% to £8.21 per hour, which gives an annual pay rise of almost £700 to full-time workers on the national living wage. This is our preferred approach to addressing low pay across both the public and private sector.
Linden.
Of course, the national living wage isn't actually a real living wage, and it doesn't apply to under 25, so that's an absolute load of mints, frankly. But why would the government want to perpetuate age inequality in terms of pay? And is he actually proud of the fact that this government actively discriminates against young people, including his own civil servants?
I do find it extraordinary the way the honourable gentleman denigrates the national living wage. The national living wage has handed a pay rise of £3,000 to the lowest paid workers since it was introduced. And it's actually rising faster than the real living wage. Of course, in respect of his question about under 25s, we need flexibility for younger workers to help them get into the labour market. I think that's a sensible compromise.
Elmore.
Well, it is, Mr. Speaker, that the government's living wage is not the living wage set by the Living Wage Commission. But that aside, can the Minister set out what representations he's made to IPSA to ensure that members of this House can become living wage employers? To my understanding is they won't let us do it.
Shane.
Well, relations with IPSA are a matter for the Leader of the House, not for the Cabinet Office ministers such as myself, but I have heard his representation. I'm sure the Leader of the House will have heard them as well.
What I can add, which I hope will be of some reassurance to the honourable gentleman, is that the House of Commons is indeed an accredited living wage employer and has been for some time. I hope that warms the cockles of the honourable gentleman's heart. Kerry McCarthy.
6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the government will work closely with the police and electoral administrators to tackle any reports or allegations of intimidation, as we do in the run-up to all elections.
Kerry McCarthy.
I'm very glad that the Minister is taking it seriously. There'll be so many of us in this House that have seen an escalation of threats and abuse in the current political climate, and there's a real fear when you have the likes of Nigel Farage saying that the European elections are an opportunity to put the fear of God into politicians, that people like that run the risk of stoking up that kind of intimidation and aggressive behaviour. What can he do to try to ensure that everyone conducts the European elections in a moderate, temperate and rational way?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, that there is a responsibility on politicians of all political parties, left, right and centre, to try to conduct elections in a spirit, yes, of democratic argument and debate, but also in a spirit of mutual respect for the fact that in a pluralist democracy we are entitled to disagree, to express our disagreement, to accept the election result, however that turns out, and then to get on with people of other parties who have an equal democratic mandate to our own.
Mrs. Theresa Villiers.
I recently had the honour to co-host a conference on misogyny and anti-Semitism, and can I urge the government to do everything it can to make sure these two forms of hate crime do not prevent women participating in elections and making their voices heard in the democratic process?
I agree wholly with what my right honourable friend has just said. I think one of the most shocking features I found about life in the House of Commons in the last few years is to learn, in particular from women MPs of different political parties, how they have often been singled out for the sort of misogynistic, brutal abuse that far too many have suffered.
Break!
Ask the Minister what support he can give to local authorities and particularly polling station staff who in fact may be the most vulnerable during the European election campaign.
Well, as the right honourable gentleman knows, we have been consulting upon creating a new electoral offence of intimidating candidates and campaigners. I think as far as the staff are concerned, any intimidation or abuse is prima facie a breach of existing criminal law, and I would hope that political party representatives and presiding officers would have no hesitation in reporting these things to the police.
Purse Glove.
I'm very clear, and I think the government is very clear, that it is the duty of all politicians and all parties to call out abuse and intimidation wherever and whenever it happens. But in this particular instance, wouldn't it just be better to keep our promises and call off these farcical elections?
It would indeed be the government's hope that even now we could agree and ratify the withdrawal agreement, give effect to it, that would make it possible for these elections not to take place. But the only way in which to stop these elections taking place is to bring into effect the withdrawal agreement or to pass primary legislation through Parliament disapplying our international obligations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But I'm very worried about the fact that other candidates are already trying to intimidate candidates. Using language like fear of God is not a good way to go about our democracy. I was at a conference this morning where a country, Eritrea, was trying to discuss how to build a democracy. Surely the Cabinet Office Minister will wish to be stronger in his language, condemning the outrageous language of other candidates, using the words like fear of God.
Mr. Speaker, I think I was very clear in my earlier comments that I think that there is a profound responsibility on politicians, particularly political leaders of any party, to show moderation and restraint in the language they use about political opponents.
Topical questions. Royston Smith.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, could I start by welcoming my honourable friend, the member for Torbay, to his new ministerial role, and to wish my honourable friend, the member for Norwich North, the best of luck as she starts her maternity leave, and to thank her for, in particular, for the work she has championed to stop intimidation in public life. Mr. Speaker, the Cyber UK 2019 Cyber Security Conference begins today in Glasgow. I'm pleased to be addressing that conference tomorrow, where I will be outlining our work to ensure that the UK remains a global leader in cybersecurity.
Royston Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State and the Minister will know that I never miss an opportunity to talk about jobs and opportunities for my Southampton itching constituents. More people are in work than ever before, but not all jobs are well paid with good opportunities. A government relocation to Southampton would help to give my constituents more opportunities. Has the Minister considered, as the part of the Places for Growth programme, a relocation to Southampton, and if not, why not?
Well, I know what a strong champion my honourable friend is for the city of Southampton. I've heard his representations. I am very happy to extend to him the invitation that officials from my department can meet with him and representatives of Southampton to see what we can do in that area.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are currently 2 million European citizens registered to vote in the UK, many of whom will be using their votes in the local elections next Thursday. But in order to be eligible to vote in the European elections on the 23rd of May, they will need to complete some paperwork. Now, so far, fewer than 300 of these citizens have completed the paperwork, which normally would have been distributed by EROs from January onwards. Due to the short timescale of administration of the European elections, I have heard that many European citizens are considering taking legal action against the government. So can I ask the Minister what consideration he has given to this and what measures the government may be able to take to help European citizens be able to use their vote in the European elections here in the UK?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the point from the Shadow Minister is about the time to make a declaration rather than the deadline for registration. She will appreciate the government obviously needs to be determined by the law and what affects it, but I must say I'll be happy to look at this and to get back a response to her in writing and also make a larger copy of that response in the library of the House.
Lee Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister what steps he's taking to encourage the use of innovative technology for the delivery of public services?
Well, this is a major priority for the Cabinet Office. That's why earlier this month I announced £1.5 million in funding for 10 projects that will use location-based data to improve public services, and why I will shortly be publishing a strategy outlining how we will harness the power of innovative technology across the whole of government.
Davy Perkins.
Speaker, millions of people are not registered on the electoral roll. They're much more likely to be ethnic minority or young or from the lower demographic classes. Doesn't it say everything about this government that at a time when we should be trying to get more people onto the register, they're doing everything they can to keep people off the register?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the government that introduced online registration that's made it much easier for people to get on the register, and it's one of the largest numbers registering. So I think the premise of his question is completely wrong.
Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that, as the Institute for Government has recently pointed out, the government has outsourced many public services precisely because the public sector was delivering them poorly, and that any plans to end outsourcing is motivated by political ideology, not by what's doing best for the taxpayer?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight these recent comments. They were clear that Labour's outsourcing policy risks creating major implementation problems and losing the benefits that outsourcing has brought for taxpayers without any guarantee those services would improve. This government will continue to make decisions on outsourcing based on the evidence, not on ideology.
Congratulating the honourable gentleman member for Huddersfield upon the birth of his 12th grandchild, another Shearmanite in the world. I call Mr. Barry Shearman.
Thank you for that. I will pass that message on to the new baby. Can I ask the Secretary of State? Yesterday, another little girl, a little Swedish girl, came to this place and reminded us how we must act dramatically to face up to climate change and the challenges of climate change. What is he doing across all departments of state to totally re-energise every department of state facing climate change now?
I think that the young woman to whom he referred spoke for her generation. And all of us going into schools and colleges in our constituency know how this issue of climate change inspires and drives political priorities amongst many of our young constituents. Every department in this government is committed to delivering the ambitious plan to reduce carbon emissions and secure our environmental objectives by the 2050 deadline. There is no difference between any minister about the need to get on with that.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker, will my honourable friend join me in welcoming the fact that disabled candidates at the up-and-coming local elections will, thanks to this government, be able to access dedicated disability-related funding to support the specific needs they face without counting towards election expenses?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's vital those standing for office are representative of our society. And as a government, we're taking action to achieve this through a £250,000 fund for disabled candidates at the forthcoming May English local election. This will help create a level playing field for disabled and non-disabled candidates.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister further outline what discussions have taken place with social media outlets such as Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter and others to strike the delicate balance of freedom of thought and opinion and security and freedom from cyberbullying?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member alludes to the fact that this will be a delicate balance to strike between ensuring people can freely express opinions and that the government doesn't get involved in the idea of regulating opinions. It's about making sure facts are accurate. And that's why we're working with colleagues in DCMS around the Online Harms White Paper to ensure we can tackle those challenges but also strike the right balance in terms of freedom of speech.
I've met with several innovative small businesses in Fareham recently, for example the SME Silver Lining, an IT business. Many of them would like more opportunities to work closely with government. What steps is the government taking to enable contracting with SMEs to take place at a greater level?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this important challenge. That's why we've set a demanding target of 33% of all government business going to SMEs, and why our forthcoming innovation strategy will look at exactly that point, how we can make it easier for SMEs to win innovative government work.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that we need to eradicate fake news at source? And this includes a more ethical approach to government advertising spend to make sure it doesn't go on these online fake news sites?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government takes disinformation very seriously, and of course the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is leading cross-government work to tackle it, including through the Online Harms White Paper. But as I say, the role of government is to make sure electors have the facts, and the facts are there in public debate, not to regulate opinions people may form on them.
Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Jack Brereton.
Number one, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been asked to reply on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who is today in Belfast attending the funeral of Lyra McKee. This was a brutal, cowardly murder of a young woman, a brilliant journalist who represented all that is good in Northern Ireland. And those responsible for her murder have nothing to offer anyone from any community in Northern Ireland. And I'm sure that members right across the House will want to join me in sending our deepest sympathies to Lyra's partner, Sarah, her other family members and her friends. And as her family have asked, we today say that we stand with Lyra. Mr. Speaker, the attack on 3 Christian churches and 3 hotels in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday was a horrific and cowardly act. And the House will know that a number of British citizens were also killed. Yesterday, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, spoke to the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka to send her condolences to all affected and to offer his government any assistance they may need. I'm sure the whole House will not only want to join me in sending sympathies and condolences to all who were caught up in that horrific attack, but I hope too that the House will perhaps reflect on the fact that that atrocity committed on Easter Sunday came just a couple of weeks after an equally brutal and appalling attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, upon the Muslim community worshipping there. And as we stand today between Easter and next week, the beginning of the solemn month of Ramadan for our Muslim fellow citizens, I hope this will be a time, not just for members, but for all our fellow citizens of all faiths and of none, to come together and to stand up for the values of mutual respect, tolerance and religious diversity, which embody what is best about our country.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to echo those thoughts of sympathy and condolence. Rejuvenating our town centres in Stoke-on-Trent is absolutely essential. Would my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the Open Doors pilot recently announced for Fenton in my constituency and agree that our future High Streets Fund bid for Longton must also succeed?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to join my honourable friend in welcoming the Open Doors pilot and his constituency, and we very much welcome bids from places like Longton Town Centre for this fund. My right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, is going to study all the bids carefully before making a decision later this year, but he and I know that my honourable friend is going to be a doughty champion of the claims of his constituency in particular.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister for the Cabinet Office and I usually enjoy trading a few jokes at these sessions, but sadly this really isn't a week for laughter. We on this side join him in standing in solidarity and shared grief with the people of Sri Lanka and all those who lost loved ones on the Easter Sunday slaughter of peaceful worshippers and innocent tourists, at least 45 of them children. And among them the 8-year-old cousin of our friend, the member for Hampstead and Kilburn, an act of utter depravity and evil which stands in sharp contrast to the words of love written by Ben Nicholson about his wife and the children that he lost. Yesterday, we also celebrated the life, but mourned the loss, of Billy McNeill, the first Briton to lift the European Cup and a man who spent his life fighting against sectarian hatred. And last Thursday, we mourned the senseless murder of the brilliant young journalist Lyra McKee, whose funeral the Prime Minister is right to attend, and whose death was a horrific reminder of where sectarian hatred ultimately leads. We stand with Lyra. In her name, Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office to tell us what the government is doing to bring her killers to justice and protect Northern Ireland from a return to terror?
Mr. Speaker, can I first very much welcome both the tone and the words of the Right Honourable Lady. And can I also say that I would share her tribute to Billy McNeill, who died on Monday. He made no fewer than 790 appearances for Celtic. It's a testament to an extraordinary career during which he also won 31 major trophies as a manager and a player. And I think our thoughts and sympathies are with his family and friends. As the Right Honourable Lady will fully understand, the decisions about criminal investigations in Northern Ireland are a matter for the Police Service of Northern Ireland and for the Independent Public Prosecution Service. We very much hope, as a government, that any member of the public who has information that will lead to Lyra's murderers being brought to justice comes forward, and I am hopeful, given the sense of community solidarity that there has been in Londonderry and in Northern Ireland generally, that information will be forthcoming.
Thornberry.
I thank the Minister for his answer, Mr. Speaker, and I know he speaks with huge authority and passion on this issue. Reading the statement from the so-called new IRA last week, with its talk of attacking enemy forces and its sincere condolences for Lyra's death, it was a sickening throwback to the days that we thought that we'd left behind 20 years ago, from despicable individuals whose only desire is to turn back the clock and destroy the progress that's been made. So does the Minister for the Cabinet Office agree with me? This is one of the central reasons that we must find an answer to the Northern Irish border question rather than give these evil terrorists the divisions that they crave.
I think that I would draw a distinction between the two. I regard both issues that the Right Honourable Lady has raised as important, but I don't think that those murderers in Derry were motivated by any thoughts about the border or about customs arrangements, important though those issues are. I think what the Right Honourable Lady said, that I wholly agreed with, was the utter unacceptability of references to police officers in Northern Ireland as if they were somehow a legitimate target. One of the great achievements of the peace-building process in Northern Ireland has been the very difficult and controversial reform of the police service, where you now have young men and women from both unionist and nationalist communities who serve gladly together, upholding law and justice in Northern Ireland. And we should, all of us in this House, continue to send every officer in the PSNI our full support.
Emily Thornberry.
I agree entirely with the sentiments expressed by the Honourable Gentleman, but can I bring him back to the issue of the border? Because I agree with the ends that he's trying to achieve, but the fundamental problem remains the means. We all know that his own party and the DUP will not accept the current backstop, that the only way the government plans to avoid that backstop is to deliver a so-called invisible border. But last week, we saw a leaked Home Office presentation stating that, and I quote, "No government worldwide currently has a system in place. Current realisation for a technological solution in the UK is 2030. And, they said, there is currently no budget for either a pilot or for the programme itself." So can the Minister tell us, are the Home Office wrong?
Well, I'm not going to comment on sort of alleged leaks from government departments. What I can say to the House is that the government has allocated £20 million to invest in work on alternative measures that would bring benefits in terms of seamless trade, both to the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but which, if successful, more generally could be applied to give us smart borders on all of the United Kingdom's external borders, and perhaps offer us some export opportunities for that technology as well.
Emily Thornberry.
Well, it's interesting what the Minister says, but the Home Office, also says that there are 6 problems with deploying these technological solutions. It's expensive, and there's no budget. 2, it has to operate with 28 different UK government agencies. 3, it needs to operate on both sides of the border. 4, it won't be deliverable until 2030. 5, the government has a poor track record, to say the least, on big tech projects, and no one, 6, in the world has done anything similar. So that, Mr. Speaker, is hardly a recipe for success. The real answer to the Northern Ireland border question is staring the government in the face. 28 months ago and 2 Brexit secretaries ago, I told the Minister from this dispatch box that the only way to avoid a hard border was staying in a customs union. And, of course, the alignment of all rules and regulations. And he indeed himself said 3 years ago, that for anyone to pretend otherwise, he said, flies in the face of reality. That was the truth then, and it remains the truth today, so why will the government just not wake up to it?
Mr. Speaker, I did say to the Right Honourable Lady in our previous exchange that there is a £20 million budget that has already been earmarked for this work. It is also the case, whatever the Right Honourable Lady may be reading in the newspapers about timetables, that not just the United Kingdom, but the European Union has committed itself to trying to get these alternative measures agreed by 2020. That is not an undertaking, a commitment that the European Commission has entered into lightly and without some thought and analysis about the chances of achieving that. But could I say to the Right Honourable Lady, the solution that she identifies of needing to have a frictionless border on the island of Ireland is what is delivered by the government's withdrawal agreement. Yes. Therefore, what she should be doing is urging her right honourable and honourable friends to vote for what the government is proposing instead of rejecting it and therefore blocking the Brexit which her party's manifesto commits her to.
Emily Thornberry.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've heard it all before, let's face it. The only point the Minister didn't make this time was that Britain must be able to establish her own international trade agreements. Perhaps he's been listening to Nancy Pelosi last week, who made it clear that if the UK government disrupted the open border in Northern Ireland, we could forget all about a free trade deal with the US. So the government is going to spend millions giving Donald Trump the red carpet, golden carriage treatment in June. And maybe the state banquet might even be worth it, so long as he's forced to sit next to Greta Thunberg. Or how about this? If then he has Greta on one side and David Attenborough on the other. That would be 3 hours well spent. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, that it will all be a giant waste of taxpayers' money because the US Congress will never agree to a trade deal unless we have a solution for the Irish border that will actually work. And this government simply doesn't have one.
Mr. Speaker, you know, it's just 2 short years ago that the Right Honourable Lady said of President Trump, "We should welcome the American president. We have to work with him." I just wonder whether something has changed about the US administration or whether something has changed about her own leadership ambitions that causes her to alter her words in this way now.
Which is it? Come on, which is it?
The government and the Labour Party, I thought, both wanted to see no tariffs, no quotas, no rules of origin checks, a seamless border on the island of Ireland. Yet 3 times, the Right Honourable Lady and her colleagues have voted against a deal that would deliver those things to which they claim to be committed. It is about time that she put principle and the national interest ahead of party advantage.
Emily Thornberry.
I think, Mr. Speaker, we'll find that there's only one side of this House that has a leadership contest at the moment, and it's very active as we speak. But, Mr. Speaker, in a week like this, when we have all been shocked and saddened by the horrific acts of terrorism at home and abroad, we remember that the first job of any government is to keep our country and our citizens safe. And even before our concerns about the economy, the main reason we need to keep an open border with Ireland is to preserve that peace and security that millions of British and Irish citizens have come to depend upon, but which, in a week like this, seems to hang like a thread. So if the government is serious about putting the country first, the whole of our country, will the Minister for the Cabinet Office accept? That means finally getting serious about the cross-party negotiations and putting the option of a customs union on the table.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Honourable Lady's not been in the room at the Times. I think she's now being described as in the sort of outer inner circle around the Labour leadership. But I can say that the substance and the tone of those conversations between the government team and the opposition team have been constructive. I think that there is a genuine attempt to try to find a way through, but I'm not going to hide the fact, Mr. Speaker, that this is very difficult, because if it's going to work, it will mean both parties needing to make compromises and us ending up with a solution that, unlike any other so far proposed, will get a majority in the House. Yeah. So far, this House has rejected our deal. It has rejected the opposition's proposals. It has rejected a referendum. It has rejected revocation. It has rejected a customs union. It has rejected Common Market 2.0. And it's not just a matter for, frankly, for government or even for the opposition front bench. It is a matter for every member of this House to take our responsibilities to the country seriously and find a way to agree on an outcome that enables us to deliver on the referendum result and to take this country forward.
Tom Pursglove. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also associate myself with the sentiments so eloquently expressed on both sides of the House? Far from what some would have you believe, those of us who voted to leave knew exactly what we were voting for. We were voting to control our own borders, to spend our own money, to make our own laws and have those laws judged by our own judges. The Labour policy now appears to be to hold a second referendum. Will my right honourable friend confirm that on his watch and that of the Prime Minister there will be no second referendum? Yes or no?
The government is very clear indeed that we do not agree with a second referendum, and we have voted against a second referendum. All of us in 2016 recall telling our electors that their decision was going to be final and would be accepted whatever the outcome of that referendum would be. And I think it would do harm to fragile public confidence in our political institutions were that a commitment to be set aside.
Ian Blackford. No.
Mr. Speaker, the SNP would join in saying that we're horrified by the atrocious attacks in Sri Lanka, and the Minister of the Cabinet Office is right that we should, all of us from all religions and none, should be considering religious tolerance and should be ensuring that we champion that. Our thoughts as the funeral commences shortly are with the family and friends of Lyra McKee, and we'd like to make clear that we stand with Lyra. We'd also like to join the celebration of Billy McNeill's life and work, and of course in addition to Celtic, he was previously a manager for Aberdeen as well in his time. Mr. Speaker, climate change is the biggest crisis facing the world today. Even the Environment Secretary has admitted that his government has failed to do enough. Yesterday he promised that the UK government would take action. Mr. Speaker, this government has spent millions on nuclear power, they've cut support for renewable energy projects, and they've continued to pursue fracking. So does taking action include reversing these damaging policies?
Mr. Speaker, I think, as my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, said yesterday, that there is clearly more that needs to be done, and probably all of us of an age to be here would recognise that our generations have not done sufficient to meet this challenge. But I think that the honourable lady underestimates how much work has been done by the United Kingdom. I mean, since 2010, we've reduced CO2 emissions faster than any other G20 nation. Between 2010 and 2018, we reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about a quarter overall. Our renewable energy capacity has quadrupled since 2010, and the proportion of our electricity coming from low-carbon resources has increased from 19% to more than half in 2018, a record year for renewables. There's a lot more to do, but I think it's a good record on which to base that future action.
Kirsty Blackburn.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think that answer recognises the scale of the challenge that we face. The Scottish Government have already brought forward a climate change bill with some of the most ambitious statutory targets of any country in the world, with the aim of Scotland being carbon neutral by 2050, and if we need to go further, we will. Mr. Speaker, the UK Government commissioned new advice from the UK Committee on Climate Change, and it's due next week, on what the UK's targets should be. Can he confirm that when the advice is published next week, that the UK Government will adopt the recommended targets immediately and in full?
I'm going to wait to see what the advice is, and I'm sure the House will want to see what the advice is, as well as learn from the government directly what its decisions are going to be. But can I say to the honourable lady that passing legislation can get you so far, but actually what you need is not just legislation, it is a change in attitude and approach that runs right across society and right across industry. And what I am encouraged by is that while since 1990 the UK has cut its emissions by 40%, in that same period our economy has grown by 2/3. So greater prosperity and green policies are not incompatible. They can and should be made to work together.
Colin Clark.
Mr. Speaker, can I associate myself with the words of the front benches? Mr. Speaker, to assure the British summer appetite for strawberries and Scottish rasps is fulfilled, would my right honourable friend encourage the Home Office to extend the seasonal agricultural workers scheme from 2,500 to 10,000 this year and open it up to 30 to 40,000 next year to make sure our appetites are fulfilled?
Well, as I would have expected, my honourable friend rightly champions both the produce of his constituency and the needs of businesses there. What I'd say to him is that obviously we have established a 2-year pilot that provides for a 6-month scheme for non-EU migrants to work on UK farms and specifically designed to help the horticultural sector. The pilot's never been designed to meet the full labour needs of the horticultural sector, and clearly we will need to evaluate what happens with that pilot in practice, but I know that the Secretary of State for Scotland and the Secretary of State for Environment and Agriculture will be looking very closely at the impact on the North East of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2015, the Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary, said that the Police Federation were crying wolf over the impact of police cuts. Now, teachers, specialist children's and youth workers and others are warning that government cuts are making it harder to protect young people from knife crime. In my current constituency crime survey, many constituents are saying that cuts to services that support young people, as well as cuts to policing, need to be reversed. So could the Minister for the Cabinet Office tell me whether he thinks children and youth workers and my constituents are crying wolf too?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the facts are that the government has increased police funding by more than £970 million for the next year, and the Labour Party voted against that increase in funding when the order came before the House of Commons. But the Honourable Lady is right to say that this is not only about policing and new laws, it is about early intervention. That's why my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has secured £220 million for early intervention projects to try to steer young people at risk of knife crime and other violent crime away from the gangs that can seduce them into that appalling way of life.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, passions are running high, including my own, about the devastating effects of climate change. And whilst I believe this government has made great strides decarbonising faster than any country in the G20, we must do more faster and sooner for a sustainable future. So would my right honourable friend ask the Prime Minister to join me in supporting a cross-party call for net zero emissions ahead of 2020? That's greater than our current calls and targets. Sorry, ahead of 2050. That's more stringent, Mr. Speaker, than our current targets. Almost 200 cross-party MPs have signed a letter calling for this, and it was instigated by my colleague from Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland. And would he also ask the Prime Minister to meet colleagues and I to discuss enshrining this in law, as proposed by my honourable friend from Cheltenham in his forthcoming 10-minute rule bill?
Well, can I first of all pay tribute to my honourable friend for the way in which she has championed this and other environmental issues during her time in the House. And I can certainly say that, a minister, I don't know whether with the Prime Minister or another colleague, will be happy to see her and other parliamentary colleagues. I hope she will understand that we will want to look at the advice of the Independent Climate Change Committee to understand what would be needed to get to that early zero emissions target and the practical steps that would involve. But I can assure her that we are investing more than £2.5 billion to support low carbon innovation in the UK in the next 6 years alone. Clean growth is a priority for the government and will remain so.
So far, I'm afraid we've managed to get through only 13 questions in more than 25 minutes, so we do need to speed up, as I wish to accommodate backbench members patiently waiting to put their inquiries. Stuart C. MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, the proposed closure of Cumbernauld Tax Office will see 1,300 good quality jobs lost to the town and many others under threat as millions of pounds of spending disappears from the local economy. And that's just one of over 150 tax office closures being overseen by the Treasury. So if the government genuinely wants to build stronger towns and is concerned about towns like Cumbernauld, surely the government must now put a stop to HMRC's damaging tax office closure.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I completely understand the concerns that there will be, particularly amongst some hard-working civil servants in Cumbernauld, who were expecting to be reassigned. There is a difference now happening in the way in which citizens choose to interact with HMRC, with fewer people wanting or needing to access an office and more people being willing and choosing to work with the taxman online, and that is clearly going to have implications. It seems to me that the priority has to be that we maintain a high quality of service to businesses and to individual taxpayers.
Mr. Douglas Ross.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will be aware of wildfires burning across the country, including one in Murray, which started near Nakando on Monday and continues despite the efforts of more than 50 firefighters. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating and praising Incident Commander Bruce Fackerson and all the teams involved and the other emergency services who have made this a multi-agency response, and also urge people to assist the fire service by keeping away from the area to allow the dedicated and committed firefighters to bring this blaze under control.
I'm happy to endorse my honourable friend's tribute to the Fire and Rescue Service in his constituency, and also to support his words encouraging members of the public to cooperate fully with those services.
Is it the government's intention to bring forward the withdrawal agreement implementation bill and to prorogue Parliament if it loses at second reading? And wouldn't it in fact be far safer for the government simply to link the Prime Minister's deal to a people's vote and bring that forward to Parliament?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the problem with that proposal is that so far, whenever the idea of a second referendum has been brought before the House, there has been a majority against that. So I don't think that the right honourable gentleman's proposal is actually going to deliver the outcome that he seeks.
Mr. David Tredenick.
Mr. Speaker, may I associate myself with remarks made about Sri Lanka? My right honourable friend tell us whether he thinks it likely we'll leave the European Union by May the 22nd. And does he agree with me that both the major political parties are likely to suffer at the polls if we don't? And what does it say to my Leicestershire constituents about the democratic process if this House can't get this withdrawal agreement to leave the European Union over the line?
Speaker, I completely understand and share that sense of exasperation that my honourable friend has expressed. I mean, it has been made very clear from this dispatch box on several occasions that the consequence of the House voting to reject the withdrawal agreement and to vote in favour of an extension is that the government would need to make preparations as required by law for those European elections. The way in which we solve this problem is for Parliament to assemble a majority behind a deal, vote for it, get the legislation through and give effect to our departure from the EU.
Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having experienced their average salary fall by over £2,000 a year since 2010 and expecting just 1% pay rise this year, civil servants in the PCS union are rightly being balloted for industrial action. Will the Minister tell the House when these civil servants will be free of austerity measures and receive a substantial pay rise which is long overdue?
Well, there has been, because of the scale of the deficit which was inherited in 2010, the need for severe restraints over public expenditure, including public sector pay. Where we are today, Mr. Speaker, is that there is flexibility within the overall pay ceiling, department by department, for departments to negotiate with their workforces arrangements that do permit higher figures for an increase in wages than the ones to which the Honourable Lady has referred.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Sunday, over 40,000 people will take part in the London Marathon. Many of them are supporting the dementia revolution on behalf of Alzheimer's research and the Alzheimer's Society. Some of those are sitting on these benches. The UK is the world leader in dementia research. I visited the Dementia Research Institute with members of the Science and Technology Select Committee today. Will the government continue to support dementia research, encourage more people especially people in their 30s, 40s and 50s, to take part in research trials, and wish the very best of luck to everyone in the marathon on Sunday.
Well, can I join my honourable friend in wishing success and strength to everybody taking part in the marathon on Sunday, particularly to members on all sides of this House, and I suspect to one or two people in the press gallery as well, Mr. Speaker. But my honourable friend makes a very important point about dementia. One of the welcome changes we're seeing is that as a society we are more open about the fact that many of us are going to live with dementia at some stage in our lives. That government commitment to which he referred to dementia research and to trying to remove the stigma from dementia will be maintained.
Last count, I was aware of no fewer than 16 honourable and right honourable members of the House intending to take part in the London Marathon, including the Secretary of State for Wales and indeed the Honourable Lady, the member for Brentford and Isleworth, from whom we heard earlier, but who was too modest or self-effacing to mention her prospective involvement. Mr. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think I could run the London Marathon, so you needn't have told me that.
You can walk it, Sammy.
While the McKee family in Northern Ireland are burying their daughter today, murdered by IRA terrorists, hundreds of people in Sri Lanka are burying their loved ones, brutally murdered because of their faith. Christians across the world are now the most religious, the most persecuted religious group, with nearly 300 million living in fear of discrimination and persecution, and 4,000 being killed every year because of their faith. The government has said that Britain is on their side. Can the Minister tell us, how is the government using the UK's soft power, our economic power, our contacts with other governments and our aid budget to help those who are persecuted daily simply because they believe in Jesus Christ?
I mean, the aid budget and the Foreign Office diplomatic expenditure budget do give will continue to give a priority to human rights, including the rights of Christians and people of other faiths. So the right honourable gentleman is quite correct in saying that in many countries Christians do face persecution and discrimination. We work to try to improve standards of justice and of civil rights in those countries. We work with Christian and other religious communities who are under threat. And my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has recently commissioned a review in particular of our work to help persecuted Christians overseas to make sure that we are focusing the right degree of resource and effort in delivering those improvements in outcome that the right honourable gentleman quite rightly seeks.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, current immigration requirements oblige Commonwealth servicemen and women to pay £2,389 to apply for indefinite leave to remain after 4 years' service, or almost £10,000 for a family of 4. This considerable cost does not reflect the nation's respect for those prepared in extremis to give their lives for our country. I therefore written a cross-party letter with the Honourable Member from Bridgend, signed by 130 Members of Parliament, to the Home Secretary to seek his support to abolish these visa fees. At a time when the UK is chair of the Commonwealth, would my right honourable friend and the Prime Minister give their support for this great non-party political cause that is supported by the Royal British Legion?
I want, Mr. Speaker, to pay tribute to men and women from Commonwealth countries who serve in our armed services. That service is something that this and previous governments have valued enormously. On the particular point that my honourable friend makes about immigration requirements, I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will take very seriously and look very carefully at the representations that he is making.
Young man.
When last month a football referee in Nottinghamshire had to flee a game, lock himself in the car and call the police, the FA response was a 6-match ban and a £50 fine. Considering what's happening to Raheem Sterling, Danny Rose and the growth of racism at every level in football, and their call for a national forum, isn't it clear that the football authorities are not capable, without our help and government help, of actually getting on top of this problem, particularly of racism in football? Will the government not take a lead in the way the Prime Minister did on Hillsborough and help convene, using their auspices, such a forum as Mr Sterling and others have requested this summer? And perhaps, Mr Speaker, you might offer this location as an appropriate venue for such a forum.
Mr Speaker, I think every member of this House will condemn without reservation the behaviour to which the honourable member referred. It is something that should be regarded as completely beyond the bounds of acceptability in our society. I can undertake that my honourable friend, the Sports Minister, will want to sit down with him and any other colleagues in the House to make this a priority in order to discuss what more might be done.
Senator Costa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday, Jane Golding, who chairs the British in Europe, representing over 1.3 million British nationals in the EU27, reminded me that Michel Barnier's letter is almost 1 month old in terms of responding to the requirement of this House to carve out citizens' rights element in the withdrawal agreement. Given the absence of a withdrawal agreement being passed in this House, can my right honourable friend inform the House what actions the government has taken since receiving Michel Barnier's letter?
Minister. Well, as I recall, what my honourable friend sought successfully was that the government should make representations to the Commission, asking them if they would carve the citizens' rights elements out of the withdrawal agreement overall. I think that there are some legal problems with that, in that the withdrawal agreement stands together as a package, and as a package has been submitted to the European Parliament, having been formally and legally approved by the European Council. And therefore, to separate elements of that might mean having to go through those European procedures again, assuming the political willingness to do so were there. But I will ask my rightful friend, the Brexit Secretary, to speak urgently to my honourable friend to give him an update on where we are on this.
Bill Esterson.
It's complacent to claim we are on target to meet our climate change obligations when emissions from air freight and shipping of imports and exports are excluded from the figures. Will this government be honest about the scale of the challenge of climate change? We need to fully invest in renewable energy, drop the fascination with fracking, and declare a climate change emergency, because that's the reality of what we face.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the rules on emissions from shipping are not sort of unique to the United Kingdom. These are global standards of measurement. And as I said in earlier exchanges, Mr. Speaker, the government's first to say that there is more that needs to be done, but I think that the honourable gentleman does us an injustice in not acknowledging that we have a better track record on this than any other member of the G7. He asked about investment. Our annual support for renewables will be more than £10 billion by 2021. We've opened the world's largest offshore wind farm, capable of powering 600,000 homes, the world's first ever floating offshore wind farm. 99% of solar power that we have in the UK has been deployed since 2010. That is a good track record.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
The government accept that the telecommunications firm Huawei is intimately linked with the Chinese Communist government and its deeply hostile intelligence services?
Well, I mean, legally speaking, it is a private firm, not a government-owned company. But my right honourable friend takes us to the question about the proposed rollout of 5G networks. The Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport has commissioned a very wide-ranging, thorough review of this. We are giving priority to stronger cybersecurity practices across the entire telecommunications sector, greater resilience in telecommunications networks, and critically, diversity in the entire supply chain for 5G, because this question goes beyond any single company. When we've taken decisions about that review, we will announce them to the House in the proper way.
Right Honourable Gentleman, Member for New Forest East, as I do, I think the Minister will recognise that he'll probably hear from his right honourable friend on this matter, well, a few hundred more times in the coming weeks. Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government continues to chronically underfund the Welsh Railway network, with planned spending running at 6%, despite having 11% of the network. So can he set out when the Government will start investing in Welsh Railway infrastructure and give Welsh commuters the investment they deserve?
Mr. Speaker, we're investing record amounts in Wales railway infrastructure. Network rail investment in the Wales route for control period 6 that takes us up to 2024 will be more than £1.5 billion. It'll deliver improved journeys for passengers in Wales on the most advanced new trains, and in South Wales, passengers and commuters are already experiencing real improvements thanks to the new Intercity Express trains, each of them having 130 extra seats compared with a typical high-speed train. I really would have wished that the honourable gentleman could have paid tribute to that achievement rather than carping.
Stephen Kerr.
Mr. Speaker, if I may add a few words of tribute of my own to Billy McNeill, who was a childhood hero of mine and truly a legendary Celt. His family, reminiscent of the question that was asked earlier by the honourable member for Chelmsford, his family have described his brave struggle with dementia. And, Mr. Speaker, my own mother passed away earlier this year due to the effects of dementia. Scottish universities are doing world-leading research into the prevention of dementia, and they currently receive about £100 million of funding each year from the European Union. Will my right honourable friend confirm that this funding will be maintained and this research will be protected as we leave the European Union?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, if we get the implementation period envisaged by the withdrawal agreement, then those funding arrangements will continue until the end of the implementation period. At that point, there will need to be decisions by government as a whole about its spending priorities, including on medical research. But as I said in response to our honourable friend, the member for Chelmsford, the government's commitment to dementia research and to ending the stigma on dementia is something that will continue.
Danielle Rowley.
Average wages stagnating for more than a decade, in-work poverty rising faster than employment, and we're hurtling towards a climate disaster. What a mess, Mr. Speaker. But in Midlothian, enterprising renewable firms and organisations are doing sector-leading work and providing good jobs, but they tell me they're not getting enough support from the government. So the Minister has boasted about renewables in this session, but will he recognise it's not enough and say what more he's going to do and what more the government are going to do to support leading work on renewables in my constituency?
Minister.
What we're seeing in this country is not only the £10 billion that I spoke about in the earlier exchange, but we are seeing enterprising, innovative companies, large and small, seizing the opportunities of developing green technology and renewable energy technology in a way that will take advantage not just of the change in the domestic market, but of that growing export market globally as well. The government will continue through its industrial strategy to work for green growth, and I hope very much that businesses in Midlothian will benefit from that, like businesses elsewhere in the UK.
Mr. Kevin Ollenrake.
Mr. Speaker, at the most recent indicative votes, the opposition did move one of its key red lines and supported a proposal that did not specify a permanent customs union, in fact supported customs arrangements, a temporary customs union followed by alternative arrangements. Now that the government and the opposition are virtually on the same page, is it not now the time to put party politics to one side and agree a deal in the national interest?
My honourable friend makes an important point, and as we look to the future relationship with the European Union, we are looking at the customs arrangement that would be in place as part of that future relationship. And we've already indicated, and this is reflected in the existing text of the political declaration, that we want to retain the benefits of a customs union: no tariffs, no quotas and no rules of origin checks. And we remain focused on agreeing an approach that delivers on the result of the referendum, which was for the UK to leave. And I hope that it will be possible to bring members from all sides of the House together in support of a customs arrangement as part of a wider approach to our future relationship with the European Union that enables us to get on with this task in the way that the British people expect.
Finally, patience rewarded. Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And to go back to what the Minister started with in this session, in a few minutes the funeral of Lyra McKee will begin in Belfast, and the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition are both present, rightly so, and we extend our deepest sympathies to her partner Sarah and to her family and friends at this terrible time. And the message across Northern Ireland is that violence is not acceptable and will never succeed, never has been acceptable and never will. And will the Minister agree that the utterly repulsive statement from those who carried out this terrible atrocity, that somehow the murder of police officers is totally legitimate and it was just an accident that Lyra was killed, that in standing with Lyra today, we stand with everyone, journalists, police officers, all who serve the community in Northern Ireland. An attack on any one of them is an attack on us all.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with every word that the Right Honourable Member has said. I thought that the finest riposte to those sickening claims by the terrorists was that there in the Cregan estate in Derry, the leaders of both the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin came together, putting aside the real differences between them, to reject the path towards violence and terror. The joint statement by all party leaders in Northern Ireland rejecting terrorism, and the visible expressions of both grief and anger towards the terrorists by the communities of both nationalist and unionist in the city of Derry, Londonderry, has been a visible but also the most compelling, moving riposte to the evil claims of those behind that terrorist act. Those political leaders, those communities in Derry, spoke for the reality and for the heart of the people of Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Order. Order. Urgent question. Sir Vincent Cable.
Will the Foreign Office Minister make a statement on the representations that the government has made to the Saudi government on the mass execution of 37 prisoners yesterday?
Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Minister Sir Alan Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, we are very concerned by the executions of 37 men in Saudi Arabia, and the Foreign Office is working to establish the full facts. The Foreign Secretary will be raising this with the Saudi authorities at the earliest opportunity, and the UK government opposes the death penalty in all circumstances and in every country, including Saudi Arabia. We regularly raise human rights concerns, including the use of the death penalty, at the highest levels with the Saudi Arabian authorities.
Sir Vincent Cable.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister specifically what representations were made in respect of the 12 condemned men that I referred to the Prime Minister's attention on the 3rd of December, including Abbas al-Hassan, who was indeed executed yesterday. Does the Minister recall his predecessor's statement on the 7th of March when he said that the Foreign Office was concerned with cases where minors have been indicted, but that he had received assurances on that matter? And is he now aware that 3 of the executed people were indeed juveniles and possibly more? Is he aware that in most of these cases, again in flagrant disregard for international law, most appear to have been tortured prior to the extraction of concessions? Does he acknowledge that so far this year there have been around 100 executions, and that according to the campaigning group Reprieve, Saudi Arabia is on track to execute 300 by the end of this year? So will he agree to meet me and representatives of Reprieve to go through the list of condemned people and seeing how representations could most effectively be made? And finally, does he not accept that Britain's moral position on this is somewhat compromised by the continued supply of arms, fueling atrocities in the civil war in Yemen, and that we are in urgent need of a reappraisal of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, given the fact that the continued medieval barbarism of this regime does not constitute the basis for a friendly alliance, and indeed makes it an enemy of our values and our human rights?
Mr. Speaker, can I say that I very much do agree with the right honourable gentleman that this does raise the gravest imaginable concerns, and that executing 37 people is a deeply backward step which we deplore. In response to the specific question about representations that have been made in the past, I can confirm that our British Embassy representatives in Riyadh did make representations last November on specific individuals. And he is also right to point out that one of the grave concerns about these executions is that it would appear to include minors, or those who were minors at the time that the charges were made. This, of course, is totally unacceptable, and we do deplore it. I can advise the House that just, I think, in the last few minutes, the European Union, and we have put our name fully to this, the External Action Service has issued a very, very strong statement of condemnation, pointing out that these executions are a regressive step, and specifically giving rise to the concerns about those being minors within the 37. In terms of our arms exports, I fully appreciate what the right honourable gentleman is saying. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia faces a number of threats. This issue of arms is not just about using arms in Yemen, but in respect of any arms exports, we do ensure that those exports fully comply with the with the consolidated criteria which govern any such sales.
Mr. Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I share the sentiments expressed by my right honourable friend at the dispatch box? The security and stability of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia matters a great deal in the region and is indeed the basis of our relationship. Notwithstanding the shared concerns we have in terms of terror, will my right honourable friend confirm that we do everything we can in using our influence to impress upon the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that that relationship carries with it obligations, and when both he and the House express themselves in such strong terms, there is usually a very good reason why we express those concerns, and those concerns should be listened to.
Yes, I'm very grateful for what my right honourable friend has said. He speaks with, I think, the utmost authority in this House. He was an excellent Minister for the Middle East, and I have to say, at a moment like this, I rather wish that he still was. He never held. I think I can say, in all honesty, that my right honourable friend, despite his, always being polite, never held back from telling the likes of his counterparts in Saudi Arabia where he thought they were making mistakes and where he thought that their record on human rights fell short. And it is by having access of that sort and by having trusted ministers on our side that I think we can most get that message over, and I hope over time make a difference.
Fabian Hamilton.
Mr. Speaker, as we've already heard, yesterday saw the largest mass execution in Saudi Arabia since January 2016, in which 37 people were killed. According to the official Saudi press agency, the men were executed, and I quote, for adopting terrorist and extremist thinking and for forming terrorist cells to corrupt and destabilise security. They were arrested after 4 Islamic State gunmen attacked a Saudi security compound in Riyadh. But the Saudi authorities have still not made clear whether those arrested were linked to the attacks. Publicly pinning one of the headless bodies to a pole as a warning is not only disturbingly barbaric and medieval in nature, but is also an abhorrent violation of human rights. Now, according to the families of those executed, there was no prior notice that the executions would be carried out. This is a blatant flouting of international standards set out by even the most brutal of regimes that still use the death penalty. Now, we know that some, if not all, of those executed were convicted in Saudi Arabia's specialised criminal court, the SCC, which has been widely condemned by human rights groups as secretive, and that has been used to try human rights activists in the past, whom the state often wrongly regards as terrorists. We also know that at least 3 of those executed were juveniles, a clear violation of international law, which the Saudi regime appears to care very little about. Abdul Karim al-Hawaj was charged with participating in demonstrations, incitement via social media, and preparing banners with anti-state slogans. Reports from human rights watchdogs in the country claim that he was beaten, and the so-called confessions extracted from him through various means of torture. Mujtaba al-Swaykat was a student about to begin his studies at Western Michigan University when he was arrested at King Fahd Airport, beaten, and so-called confessions extracted through torture. Salman Quresh was just 18 when he was executed, but convicted of crimes that allegedly took place while he was still a child. The UN has condemned his sentencing and the use of the death penalty against him after he was denied basic legal rights such as access to a lawyer. Saudi Arabia, as we've heard, has executed more than 100 people already this year. If it continues, the number of executions alone will reach 300 in 1 year. The human rights group Reprieve say that 5 of the prisoners they supported were executed yesterday. Many were forced to stand in stress positions for hours and deprived of sleep until a confession was extracted. These executions, Mr. Speaker, have caused a breakdown in Saudi Arabia's relations with Iran and has the potential to further destabilise the region. So, what discussions has the Minister had with his Saudi counterpart since the executions took place? Will the government condemn the use of the death penalty in Saudi Arabia today? Will the government call for an immediate end to executions in Saudi Arabia? And finally, what plans does the government have to tackle the use of violence against human rights activists in Saudi Arabia?
I yield to none in my affection and admiration for the honourable gentleman. He is, however, fortunate that I'm in a generous mood, as I just note in passing that he was due to speak for 2 minutes, spoke for a little over 3, and his first of, I think, 4 questions was posed after 3 minutes and 1 second. So it was a volley of insurpassable eloquence, but it was a tad too long. Sir Allen.
I take that as you instructing me to be suitably short, Mr. Speaker, which...
Right Honourable Gentleman and I have shared in common a characteristic of being short, and we have done so for some decades, as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows.
I will happily confirm that you always win, Mr. Speaker, but I will not say in which direction I'm pointing. Look, I don't think really anyone in this House would disagree with what the Honourable Gentleman has said. All in this House will want to defend human rights, and we abhor executions of this sort. I mean, we really do genuinely disapprove in the strongest possible terms what has happened, particularly when it's reported that one of them was displayed on a cross, something that anyone in this House just a few days after Easter would just find more repulsive than anything we could picture. But we also have to be sure of our facts. I think we need to find out directly what precisely were the supposed crimes, what was the due process that was used. And I think that although the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia can legitimately use its law to bear down on genuine extremist threats, I think they must appreciate that there will be growing international pressure to accept that the sort of action we're discussing today is utterly unacceptable in the modern world. It does them no credit, and it does not really support the basis of law which any proper country should be working on.
Mr. Crispin-Blunt.
Having worked on a detention review panel of the female human rights activists in Saudi Arabia, along with my honourable colleagues from Stockton South and Oxford West and Abingdon, does my right honourable friend accept that these executions and the accelerating pace of executions in Saudi Arabia cannot be seen in isolation from the wider criminal justice policy, if that's what one should call it, that relates to the murder of Adnan Khashoggi, as well as the detention of civil society activists in Saudi Arabia? And if Saudi Arabian civil society space is closed down in the way that it is being doing so, the security and stability of Saudi Arabia, our ally in the end, will be the victim.
Minister of State.
I think my honourable friend has a serious point, that any country needs to realise that when it uses methods like this, they will eventually backfire. And although I think there are greater arguments for pointing out how unacceptable they are, it is wise for rulers to be mindful of such dangers. I didn't answer the question put by the honourable member from the front bench, was about human rights defenders, and I have to say, yes, we will raise the issue of freedom and protection for those who defend human rights. It is not acceptable to attack NGOs when what they are doing is trying to defend justice.
Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Twickenham for securing this question as well. Mr. Speaker, we're here to discuss yet more appalling human rights violations, and there is huge concern about this latest mass execution, not only whereby it's reported that a number of those executed were from the Shia minority, but critically, and as other members have pointed out, that those put to death were minors at the time of the alleged crimes. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've been here rather frequently to discuss human rights violations, what's happening in Yemen, the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. It has been raised, and when we raise it and when we talk about arms sales and our relations, we're told that we have influence. It's difficult to see that influence at the moment, Mr. Speaker. So, does he agree, as others have asked, that we must reassess the relationship with Saudi Arabia? And instead of us coming back time after time to discuss more of these issues of concern, will he commit to come back to this House and tell us what has been done about that reassessment of our relationship with Saudi Arabia?
Minister of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will be discussing this with the Foreign Secretary, and he will be calling his counterpart, the relatively new Foreign Minister in Saudi Arabia. But I think the honourable gentleman has a very serious point, which we should all take on board, which is that the broader picture does give growing cause for concern. If you look at those who have been executed and the number, Shia, minors, those whose crimes we do not know, the Khashoggi incident, I think that we will, I'm sure, be very robust in the representations we make in the embassy and at minister-to-minister level. And it's very important, I think, that the regime in Saudi Arabia appreciates that world opinion can only get louder in its voice of condemnation.
Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The King of Saudi Arabia has been reported as being interested in ensuring prison reform in his kingdom. Will my right honourable friend reassure me that conditions in prison will be on the agenda next time he raises human rights with the Saudis?
Well, I think this is a very important agenda. Indeed, when I was a minister at DFID, I always wanted prison visiting and prison access to be a condition of any aid that we gave to a country. I didn't exactly succeed in my objective, but I think that what my honourable friend has illustrated shows the importance that when you have people who are hidden and no one can get to them, you don't know what's going on. And so for decent people to be able to inspect prisons and visit prisoners, as we have in this country, is, I think, a very important part of any judicial system and of the human rights that ought to go along with them.
And Clwyd.
Mr. Speaker, Saudi Arabia is now one of the world's top executioners, behind only China and Iran. And Amnesty International called the recent executions, a chilling demonstration of the Saudi Arabian authorities' callous disregard for human rights and human life. It is also yet another gruesome indication of how the death penalty is being used in that country as a political tool to crush dissent from within the country's Shia minority. These Shia men apparently were convicted after sham trials that involved torture, and I think we must condemn in the strongest possible terms, including some kind of action. Words are easy, but let's have some kind of direct indication from the UK. We will not put up with this kind of thing.
Minister of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no one can question the Right Honourable Lady's track record in defending human rights, and we hear very loudly what she says today. I think one of the questions we need to point out to the Saudi government is what on earth they think this is going to achieve. The practical benefit seems entirely negative. And I very much hope that rational arguments to say that in the modern world the death penalty achieves nothing might, I hope, eventually sink in.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Does the Minister feel, as I do, that the feebleness of the response to the Khashoggi murder and the butchering of his body has in some way encouraged the Saudi authorities to think they can get away with anything, no matter how brutal and borderline insane?
Minister of State.
I don't think I quite agree with my right honourable friend. I mean, I think that the international reaction was pretty robust, and it was a collective voice which condemned it, led, of course, by Turkey, in whose country this happened. I would like to think that that incident has a dividend and that it has got through to people that this is unacceptable, and they were taken aback by the fact that the murder of one person counted for so much elsewhere in the world, and I hope will never be repeated.
Mr. Andrew Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are three further juveniles or young men who were arrested after the Arab Spring for peaceful protest, Dawood al-Maroon, Ali al-Nimra and Abdullah Hassan al-Zahar, who've gone through the same process and are awaiting execution by beheading now on death row, which could happen at any time at no notice. Will the government make specific representations for those three? Because otherwise we will be seeing more of these executions as the year progresses.
Well, I think the event of these 37 executions will spur us to take a deep interest not just in the general concept and principle of the death penalty, but in individual cases. And given the robustness of the European Union statement that has just been issued, I'm confident that we will not be alone in making our opinions clear.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Can we have a measure of repentance about the enthusiasm with which we sponsored Saudi Arabia for the UN Human Rights Council?
I think I'm always happy to be repentant to my right honourable friend. I'm not familiar with the exact details of what he's referring to, but look, I maintain the position that I've been speaking about today is that we will make our views on these issues very clear in a very robust way to the Saudi government.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I remind the House that I chair the All-Party Group on Qatar. I'm an officer of the All-Party Group on Kuwait. And I say that because I hope the Minister will accept that he doesn't need to persuade me of the importance of creating good relations with our friends in the Gulf. But when I read not just about the use of capital punishment, but the use of torture in order to obtain confessions on which the executions are then carried out, including the use in relation to Munir al-Adam, who was beaten so badly that he lost the hearing in one ear, I find myself asking, why does the government of my country want to regard these people as our friends? Surely this is a time for a fundamental reappraisal of our relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
I can say to the House, Mr. Speaker, that we unreservedly condemn torture in all circumstances. I understand what he's asking for, and I think, Mr. Speaker, we have to look at the broader picture of the entire Gulf and the dangers around it, and that is always what is taken into consideration when looking at who we work with across the world.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr. Speaker, I know how much my right honourable friend cares and works very hard on these matters of human rights. But given that now the European Union has also condemned what is happening, can we make sure that this is not just the kind of ritual condemnation that happens immediately after an event and then is forgotten, but that at every opportunity in his dialogue with Saudi counterparts, he stresses the absolute importance that this country and our European partners hold, the value that we place on freedom, on human rights, on religious freedom, and all those areas which would be of great benefit to Saudi Arabia if they were to embrace them.
Mr. State.
I think my honourable friend is right. It is no good just having a day's anger after an event like this. This has to be persistent and consistent, and the representations and the condemnation of executions of this sort and any abuse of human rights has to be built into our policy and our actions at all times.
Alison Hewlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Human rights abuses, executions, airstrikes in Yemen killing 100 in March alone, including 19 children. If the Saudis continue to fail to listen to the Minister's pleading, why does he extend to them the veneer of respectability?
Minister of State.
I think, as the Honourable Lady knows, and she mentions Yemen, I'm someone who has spent many decades taking an interest in Yemen. I hope that we will now see some progress towards a political settlement. We have to give our full support to Martin Griffiths, the UN representative, but I think that part of the message we have to make to the Saudi government is that bombings in Yemen don't really achieve any of the objectives they've set out to achieve, and that we need a political settlement as a matter of urgency.
Robert Court.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend reassure my constituents that this country does not pursue trade at the expense of human rights?
No, I can give that assurance. We obviously want to defend human rights everywhere, and we want to maximise our trade, but we will not pursue a trade opportunity at the expense of human rights, and I can give him that assurance.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems difficult to fathom the logic of such senseless barbarism in the policies of Saudi Arabia, but clearly this is having wider implications, particularly in relation to Iran and the geopolitical stability of the Middle East. So at what point will this country's commercial and geopolitical interests become second to the need to actually demonstrate moral courage and show that there will be real economic consequences for Saudi Arabia's continued behaviour?
Well, we do value our trade with Saudi Arabia, as indeed with all partners in the Gulf, but we have to make sure that commercial activity of that sort goes hand in hand with the robust political messages that we all share in this House today.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, as the member for Cannon Valley mentioned, the vast majority of those executed yesterday were Shia Muslims. To what degree does the British government consider that the Saudi regime are using the death penalty as a means of quashing dissent amongst a persecuted religious minority within their borders?
I don't think this is the moment for me to sort of give an extended thesis on such matters, but I understand the suggestion. that the Honourable Gentleman is making. The Sunni-Shia conflict in many parts of the Middle East is very intensive and creates enormous tension, difficulty and strife. And I just very much hope that in the years ahead we can see the temperature settle and good relations between the Sunni and Shia communities everywhere find a better course.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wondered what more the government could do through the embassy in Saudi Arabia to work with civil society, women's groups in particular, and human rights defenders to ensure that human rights are upheld in the kingdom.
Minister of State.
No, I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to raise this point. As a government, we tend to attend internationally important trials in all countries, indeed where it's permitted, of course, by the host government. We have been denied access to trials in certain circumstances in Saudi Arabia, and I think that defending human rights activists and NGOs is very important. And to that end, our embassy is very, very active, and some of their engagement with them may not be popular with the government, but that's what our embassies should be doing, because they are defending justice and decency and human rights, and that is what our foreign policy is designed to do.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These men could not have been convicted in any court worthy of the name, because a conviction that relies on evidence obtained through torture is no conviction. In the eyes of any law, these men were innocent. They were not executed. They were murdered for dissenting from the policies of the dictatorship that runs a country. The Minister has listed a lot of things that the government have done previously that has made no difference. If anything, Saudi Arabia is going in the wrong direction. He's ruled out a fundamental rethink of a relationship with Saudi Arabia. He's ruled out a fundamental rethink of a multi-billion-pound arms trade with Saudi Arabia. Can the Minister tell us what else is left that the government haven't already tried and failed to persuade these people that the regime does not belong in the 21st century?
Well, I think that, first of all, we do have to be certain about establishing the facts in these cases. I know that a lot of suggestions have been made about lots of things that may have happened with the 37, but before we speak with the authority of government, we do very much feel obliged to establish all the facts first and to engage the Saudi government in doing so. In terms of what can be done, I again go back to the point about growing international pressure, and I hope that by acting in concert with other countries, we can, perhaps on the back of these executions, make a difference to future policy and behaviour in the kingdom.
Steve McCabe.
Mr. Speaker, this is an ally whose behaviour is as bad, if not worse, than most of the regimes around the globe that we would regard as hostile. I guess that ordinary constituents listening to this and reacting to the barbarism will want to know, is there a bottom line? Is there a point at which this becomes a friendship not worth having?
Minister of State.
I think the Honourable Gentleman is right to point out there is a moral dilemma here.